All right, Psalm 18, let's call this one. We might want to inherit according to one standard, but we really inherit according to what we actually do in this psalm, where David is going to seem to describe the ways in which not only he is held accountable, but the way in which God seems to set the standard for accountability. And ultimately, David's enemies are also held accountable for the things they have done, where David starts out once again, I call to the Lord, this time because the cords, the torrents, and the snares set against him by his enemies were simply too much for him. And when the chapter describes the torrents, it goes back to something we mentioned in the introductory sermon to the Psalms that we entitled Like Water, understanding that the Psalms can function like water in multiple ways, meaning you don't have to do a whole lot of complicated explanation of what water means to a thirsty man. So sometimes it can simply function as a drink to the thirsty or those who are in need. But there is a science behind water, and likewise there is a science behind both the structure and the application of the Psalms. And then finally, sometimes like water, it can come in like a flood. And sometimes that flood is the overwhelming judgment that we feel from God when we are being held accountable for things that we have done wrong. But sometimes it is simply the overwhelming reality of the enemy set against us. And when David is describing the torrent in this chapter, that seems to be what he is describing, because he is going to go on to say that just as the enemy came in like a torrent, God responded to his call with what seemed to be an overwhelming response to his enemies that he is again going to describe as a flood, using a metaphor that the Revelation also uses to describe many peoples. And it seems that that is how David is using it here, because he goes on to describe that enemy as, once again, overwhelming or too much for him. As he goes on to say, as he often reminds us in the Psalms and in other places, that God did not simply save him because he was some sort of favorite, but God saved him according to his righteousness and the cleanness of his hands. Thus the title of this chapter. David got a response from God according to what he actually did. And so he's going to go on to say that that is not just a general concept, because like we've talked about before, righteousness is kind of a term for measurement, meaning it's not simply an ideal. There is a measurement for whether or not we are actually doing the right things, because it's one thing for me to intend to do the right thing, to work real hard at it, but to produce faulty results. David was living the kind of life, as we've said before, that does not simply call on God in difficult times. But maybe look at it this way: in a teacher-student relationship, it is probably easier for a teacher to have respect for a student that she sees working hard, or he sees working hard, consistently showing up early to class, staying late, asking for help as they need it. And so when they fail or make a mistake, it's probably easier to forgive that student. Look at it from another perspective. On the job, when you have to work with a group of people, but there are some who elevate themselves by, once again, showing up early, going in, and not only working with the kind of enthusiasm that leads them to give more than what the job requires, but to do it in a trustworthy manner. Because it's one thing to be productive, but if you're there pilfering and stealing, you can't really be trusted. But when you see an employee that not only comes in early, works hard, and is trustworthy, meaning you can turn your back and trust that things are going to work well, when that person screws up, it probably hurts you to even have to discipline that person because of how much they mean to what you are trying to accomplish. More importantly, when you find them somehow harassed or even terrorized by people who are not trying to help you accomplish your legitimate goals, you might find it a joy to help provide them some relief from the people who are causing them misery. Thus the end of this chapter, where David goes on to describe the ways in which God seems to have found joy in providing him strength, in a famous passage that says, "You train my hands for war." Because as it goes on to say, no matter how long David had to wait for God to step in on his behalf, when God did step in, the part about God seeming to set the example for accountability comes in David saying God's words to him proved true. So God didn't just say things and let you know that you got to do it just because he is the one in charge. The things that he promised David proved true, and that helped to build the trust between God and David. Likewise, in our relationships, to the degree the things that we are telling people prove true, that helps to provide a bond in our relationships that, God willing, in difficult times is difficult to break. As David moves on to the end of the chapter to describe the way in which his enemies are held accountable, once attacking him in a way that seemed to be merciless, now being in a position where God refuses to listen to their pleas for mercy. Likewise, just as many people found it a joy to assemble themselves against David, God is now flipped that situation to put many peoples in subjection to David. And so just as Psalm 18 takes us back to a time in David's life when God made him an authority over people that were honestly too mighty for him to overcome on his own, my prayer for you is my prayer for me, that once again, as we have seen before, that we live the kind of lives that actually make it a joy for God to give us the kind of vindication and success that goes far beyond anything that we could produce on our own.